Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today, I'm going to be discussing a very unique type of sonata form and analyzing the last movement of Mozart's Quintet in G minor, K516. This movement is a Type 4, Type 1 expansion sonata form. We've discussed both the Type 4 and Type 1 sonatas previously, but we've never dealt with the hybrid type or the expansion subtype. It affects the recapitulation, though, so we can deal with it then. Because before we even start getting theoretical, I want to discuss some of the reception history of this piece, and in particular, this movement, as it's partially what drew me to this piece in the first place. When I'm considering a new piece, I often check the index of works in Elements of Sonata Theory to see if there is anything Hepokoski and Darcy have to say about it. In their chapter on 3 and 4 movement sonata cycles, I came across this. Although Mozart does write major mode finales to minor mode works, most controversially in the G minor string quintet, he more often retains the minor mode to the bitter end. Naturally, my curiosity was piqued. Why is this movement controversial? So, obviously I went where I'm sure everyone would go next, Wikipedia, where I found this gem about the fourth movement. The start of the fourth movement is not the typical quick tempo finale, but a slow aria back in the home key of G minor. It is a dirge or lament that is even slower than the previous movement. The music remains in this dark area for a few minutes before reaching an ominous pause. At this point, Mozart launches into the ebullient G major allegro, which creates a stark contrast between it and the movements that precede it. Critics have often questioned how such an insouciant and carefree finale could follow after 3 movements of intense pathos, even though it conforms perfectly to the classical understanding of a finale as resolving everything that preceded it. Generally, Wikipedia is good for giving a snapshot of how some people view a piece of music. It's not always right, and generally the interpretation of music is an opinion anyway, but whose opinion it is does matter. And 2 of these claims have citations. So I first checked out Melvin Berger's book on chamber music, where I found this passage. An ominous pause signals the break between the lyrical, though palpably despondent, adagio and the start of the faster and carefree allegro. While some critics find the allegro trivial in this context, most admire its insouciant gaiety. Amidst the plethora of carefree motifs, one can easily surrender to the movement's high spirits and forget all the pathos that came before. An ominous pause? Unnamed critics accusing Mozart of trivial frivolity? And the statement that most admire the movement's insouciant gaiety. Insouciant, showing a casual lack of concern or indifference. I wouldn't say that that is too different from the word frivolous. I don't know about you, but this is exactly the kind of thing that interests me the most. When I hear that someone thinks something is frivolous, my immediate reaction is, well, maybe you just don't understand it, Janet. Charles Rosen, the other citation on Wikipedia, notes that this finale is in keeping with the classical sonata cycle, the journey from tragedy to triumph being often associated, perhaps erroneously, with Beethoven. But Rosen gets nearer to my own view when he makes the assertion that a major mode finale is similar to a larger scale Picardy third. A Picardy third is when a minor mode work is ended with a major chord. Picardy thirds are often dripping with irony. They are not a sign that all is well and a Hail Mary pass has solved the problems of the minor mode, but rather an illustration or reinforcement of the tragic. To back up my view, let's take a closer look at this complicated form and see if we can hear any of the ominous pauses, triviality, insouciance, or even irony. The movement begins with a slow introduction in the minor mode. I've covered slow introductions in a sonata theory basics video, and this one, though larger in scale than usual, and appearing on the fourth movement, when the first movement would be a more typical place, doesn't really break the mold too much. We don't really have heraldic calls to action, but the other three zones are certainly present. Quieter material, sequences, and as we'll see, there is a dominant preparation which will prepare the sonata. That's the alleged ominous pause that Melvin is referring to. As far as what interpretive meaning we might assign to this, I don't notice any motivic material that I think corresponds particularly closely with what's about to follow, so I would say this introduction is more of a representation of, quote, the world, end quote, that this piece, and specifically this movement, finds itself in. And as it's in the minor mode throughout, much like the rest of the piece, I think we have to intuit that the world of this quintet is very dark indeed. So in that sense, I probably would say the pause at the end of this section is ominous, but it's my feeling that it's not more ominous than any initially unresolved dominant in the minor mode. As we continue with the sonata form, which is a type 4, so rather than P, you'll see I've marked the P refrain and also ABA for the section. Let's see if this is trivial or ironic or what. I tend to think that a tonic pedal is not a positive sign for a primary theme section. Unlike a dominant pedal, which implies a sense of forward momentum, a sense of striving for the tonic, a tonic pedal gives me a sense of arrested development. When the harmony does wrench itself out of this stasis, I don't really hear it as a cadence until the end of the A section. But you can see here that the cadence is blocked from having structural weight by this appoggiatura on A. If you recall, this is something that the primary theme in the first and third movements, and now in the fourth movement, all had in common, almost an inability to reach a cadence. After the B section and the brief reprise of A, the P refrain is a small ternary, or large binary form, they're basically synonymous, within the larger form. You can see the same blocked cadence, which will recur through the sonata. I think something that makes this movement and many type 4 sonatas difficult to analyze by ear is the often used repeated sections. What can initially seem like transition is simply the middle of the primary refrain. I would say that the transition begins in measure 59, and of particular note is its struggle to modulate into the dominant key. It takes multiple attempts. You may notice the end of this section has what we might call a caesura, but it's followed by more of the transition. It's not really functioning as a caesura, probably because it's blocked by the appearance of more TR material, a recognition that the piece has not yet modulated into the dominant. The end of this repeat section is a second blocked medial caesura. This transition is having a real problem articulating its cadences. But finally, a third attempt, which interestingly uses the same caesura fill as in the prior blocked MC. The secondary theme, which follows, has more of a Haydn flavor than is typical for Mozart, and it also has a bit of a mode problem. We're going to be flashing back and forth between the desirous major mode and the tragic minor. Although in any sonata form, major or minor, an S-theme cadencing in minor is really the worst-case scenario, a D minor secondary theme, especially when the remainder of the piece has been in G minor, gives me the sense of the curtain parting. Rather than the chipper G major followed by D major, Mozart is dropping the facade and reminding us that this is him dancing as fast as he can. And perhaps it won't be fast enough. The closing module, like the primary theme, is also quite extensive. It includes so many distinct themes and cadential repetitions, it almost feels as though it's overcompensating. Don't look at the two failed medial caesuras and the secondary theme that almost slipped into minor. We've reached the structural cadence. Dance! These little 16th note chromatic figures are especially uncomfortable, starting as they do on a G sharp against an A in the bass. The final closing zone, C4, ends with a transition that brings us back into G major. A type 4 sonata, even when they do include a development, will always open a second rotation with a tonic repetition of the primary refrain. In almost all cases, if a second rotation opens off tonic, you need to carefully reevaluate whether the piece is actually a type 4 sonata. I've already given the game away slightly and let you know that this is a type 4, type 1 subtype, which means that although the form is in dialogue with a rondo and will have multiple rotations, each beginning with the tonic primary refrain, there is not going to be a corresponding off-tonic development rotation. As you can see, Mozart is veering off the rotational correspondence guideposts. As I said, this Type 4 Type 1 combo is also a subset of Type 1 sonatas known as an expansion subset. A Type 4-1 expansion, a real mouthful, but sonata theory is really just creating a taxonomy that makes analyzing and identifying what's happening in a sonata easier, is an expanding or billowing out of the primary and transition zones. Of course, P and TR are typically recomposed in the recap, but this goes beyond just recomposition of sections. What's about to follow is an entirely new, and quite charming, P section, P2. It's in the subdominant key of C major, which Mozart often emphasizes in his recapitulations. And although all of its cadences occur on beat 2, making them a touch weaker than they had been on the downbeat, they also do come to a PAC, meaning the expansion actually comes to a much stronger close than the original primary refrain. As this new P-zone is a new theme, it is more in dialogue with a rondo and actually de-emphasizes the sonata side of the coin. If you're going to be doing your own analysis, especially of finales where this subtype of sonata appears from time to time, let me share this word of warning from the elements of sonata theory. For inexperienced analysts, the Type 4-1 expansion sonata contains a number of traps into which it is all too easy to fall. The most tempting analytical misstep, though, are readily avoided if one approaches the structure with a firm grasp of the rotational practice guiding the large-scale events. I can tell you from personal experience, this is a somewhat hazardous type of finale to analyze. I spent about as much time analyzing this finale as I did the other three movements altogether. But as Hepokoski and Darcy point out, the rotational aspects of sonata form really reveals what's happening. We know a new rotation has started by the tonic entrance of the primary refrain, and as we continue to listen, we can see that the secondary theme is actually brought in with correspondence to the exposition. And, as in the exposition, this transition also includes a blocked medial caesura, but now with a new hint, again at D minor. Rather than a half cadence, the secondary dominant here cadences in minor, and is followed by a deceptive cadence, which is also something that's been very present in all of the previous movements of this piece. As in the exposition, the S theme is motivic and can't avoid frightening us with a few PACs in the minor mode before opening a G major ESC. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, well this is interesting, but why is this a Type 4 sonata rondo hybrid and not simply the Type 1 sonata, which also has no development? You may recall that in my video about the third movement, which is also a Type 1 sonata, I mentioned that a Type 1 sonata with a discursive coda can sometimes blur the line between a coda and a new rotation. The line is not a fixed border, but rather a porous one. As the 4 closing zones transition into a third rotation, you'll see what I mean. If you recall, the P-based coda in Movement 3 was not a complete reiteration of the P theme, but simply used its motivic material, whereas I think you can see, this coda is actually a complete reiteration of the primary refrain in the tonic mode, and not only the primary theme, but also the small ternary, or large binary, theme construction of the entire primary refrain. This larger and more complete sense of a third rotation is what separates a Type 1 sonata from a Type 4 Type 1 hybrid. In regards to how this finale fits into the larger sonata cycle as a whole, what these movements all had in common was a difficulty, or in some cases, the impossibility, of reaching cadence, particularly in the primary theme zone. Also, all the sonata form movements have secondary themes which flirt with the minor mode. In the first movement, which was in minor, this was dire enough. But in the third and fourth movements, the surrounding major modes made the flashes of minor all the more poignant, and even somewhat terrifying. Another common thread between all the sonata movements was the development, or lack thereof. The first movement had an extremely brief developmental rotation, while the third and fourth movements omitted the section entirely. And also, probably most unusually for the high classical period, is Mozart's use of discursive codas on each of the first, third, and fourth movements. In the case of the first and fourth movements, these codas were even rotational. In regards to my opening questions regarding the insouciant frivolity of this finale, I would be very interested in your opinion, but personally I tend to agree with Charles Rosen's interpretation that the fourth movement, though in a major mode, is a partially ironic and also nearly tragic itself addition to the quintet. Of course, a large part of sonata theory is broadly interpreting the major as positive and the minor as negative, but the word broadly is really doing some heavy lifting there. I would say that is the trap that Melvin and his unnamed critics fell into when describing the movement as frivolous or insouciant. Yes, the finale is in major, but that doesn't make it a triumph. The finale of Beethoven 5, triumphant as it sounds, does not reach actual tonal closure within the sonata and therefore is also tinted with tragedy. Tonal closure is left to the coda in the case of that finale. I wouldn't say the last movement of this quintet was tragic, but I would say it narrowly avoids tragedy. All of its cadences were hard-won, and at crucial moments, the minor mode would flash back into terrifying reality again and again. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really hope you enjoyed this full series of analysis on Mozart's quintet in G minor. The channel schedule coming up in the rest of October and November is going to be a lot of Brahms. The poll on my Patreon was between multiple pieces by Brahms and Tchaikovsky, and Brahms' Second Piano Concerto won. I'll be analyzing the entire 40-minute piece, so this quintet and the Haydn quartet I did a few weeks ago were practice runs for a much larger structure. If you'd like the ability to vote for pieces to be analyzed, you can find the link to my Patreon below. You get voting power at the $3 tier, but at all tiers, even $1, you get early access to videos when I manage to finish them early, and at the $5 and $10 tiers, you can receive some selections from any research materials I use, as well as copies of my scores and scripts as PDFs. As always, please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, feel free to comment below or send me an email.